Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm very honoured today to be joined by Dr. Agnes Arnold Foster, author of Nostalgia, a history of our kind of understandings of the past, I suppose, and sentiments around the past. I was just discussing that. I thought it was really, really intriguing thesis and one I wanted to explore today. Agnes, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the kind of the process by which the book came about, because it's a very kind of intriguing one.
Sure. The boring answer, I suppose, is that I'm a historian of medicine mainly. I'm an academic, and I was working on the history of the NHS, and I was doing all these interviews with doctors and nurses and midwives, talking to them about their experiences, how they felt that the NHS had changed while over the course of their careers. And pretty much everyone I spoke to was super nostalgic about the NHS of days gone by.
Mm.
Um, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. It wasn't something I expected. So I started working on an academic article about nostalgia in the NHS. While I was doing that, I was asked by a radio producer who was working with my university at the time, Queen Mary, to do a little podcast about an emotion of my choosing. And since I was working on nostalgia, I was like, well, this is the obvious choice. And to do that podcast, it was only about 5 or 10 minutes long, just me kind of talking about an emotion and its history. I had to do some more research into nostalgia, and I sort of delved into its longer history
Mm.
and basically just went down a massive rabbit hole and only re-emerged about 4 years later with a book. So that's I suppose, scholarly answer. The other answer is that I am personally very nostalgic.
Mhm.
Or at least I used to be when I was a kid. I was a really nostalgic child, really into the past. I mean, slightly unsurprisingly, considering where I ended up professionally, but also really into like historical fiction, like Enid Blyton and Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie. And I just felt really betrayed somehow that I'd been born in the wrong decade. I really wanted to live in a different time. And so I've always had this kind of interest in nostalgia, kind of pull to that kind of sentiment. But obviously, had to kind of reckon with how that sits with, being an academic historian as well. And sometimes they're a bit, they come into conflict with one another. But
Would you
yeah.
say is nostalgia a kind of like a product of modernity? I mean, were there people in the Tudor era thought, "Phew, when King John was in charge, so much better then," or is it to do with our understanding of time and our understanding of progress, and where we are intellectually?
I mean, those are both great possible explanations, I suppose, for nostalgia's sort of morphing, transforming nature. Because I think one of the main things that I'm interested in, and one of the main things I write about in the book, and I'm sure lots of people know, is that nostalgia has changed very dramatically. That in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, it was a disease that killed people, a kind of pathological homesickness. Then in the 20th century, it transformed into the sort of longing for a bygone era kind of,
Hmm.
thing that we know and love it to be today. Um, but that transformation is partly transformation in terminology, right? So the word changed its meaning over the course of that time. And so the question remains, as you sort of like point to, like, did people feel the same yearning and longing before the word nostalgia meant that? Like, did people in Tudor times and King John's time in ancient Greece feel that kind of nostalgia, that the nostalgia that we know it to be?
Hmm.
And I suppose my answer to that question is we don't know. We cannot really know. We can't get access to the inner thoughts and feelings of people in the past in that way. We can speculate based on things they wrote down and the way they described their feelings, but one of the kind of main, I suppose, arguments of the history of emotions, the kind of sub-discipline that I sit in, is that emotions change over time. As you say, that lots of emotions are products of modernity, or at least the particular kind of shape and inflection are products of modernity. So nostalgia could be one of them. People have posited, like you say, kind of changing relationship with time, but also with aging, that now we can expect to live a lot longer, that we can expect to grow into old age. And so that shifts our relationship with our own memories and with the way that memories matter to our identities. But another great example is something like anxiety. Like lots of people, lots of historians argue that anxiety is very much a product of modernity, that we don't really have the terminology of anxiety, but also we don't think, even if people did feel worried or uncertain or concerned about things in the past, which I'm sure they didn't necessarily articulate it in the same way that we do now. They didn't
Yeah.
necessarily think about it in quite the same terms. And so although there probably is some sort of like, you know, some sort of thing that we share with people in the past in terms of like our
Mm.
emotional inner lives, exactly the emotions we feel and what they mean change quite
Mm.
dramatically over the course of human history.
It's interesting that you mention, this period in around the 17th and 18th century when there is, I think, is that the first identifiable kind of writings on this phenomenon of nostalgia? And I suppose that you start to get the first kind of speculative fictions about the future around that point. Well, the first that we know about, anyway. I mean, there might have been, you know, Venerable Bede might have been writing science fiction. We don't know, but and there seems to. I wonder if there's some sort of relationship there. The people you look at the future, and then there are conceptions about the pace of change, and there are emotions about the past emerge.
I think that's definitely part of it. I think that, that is, I mean, there are lots of debates over when modernity start. You can kind of locate that in lots of different points. And some people argue that that moment, the kind of late 17th, early 18th century, is kind of the birth of global capitalism. And so that's the kind of birth of modernity or modern life as we know it to be now. And so, and with that comes all these sort of transformations of the way that we think about ourselves, write about ourselves, do all the things that you say, think about the future, but also the past.
Mm.
I'd say that the thing that's also quite important for that moment in time when it comes, especially when it comes to nostalgia, is that this is also the first time that larger numbers of people are traveling great distances away from home. And
Right.
obviously not loads of people, but this is the start of big global empires. It's not, it's not their peak, but it's when people have started traveling. The technology of travel gets a lot better at this time. Ships can travel greater distances. It's only 100 years ago or so before that the Americas are, quote unquote, discovered. But it's also a time when, big military endeavors, there's a lot of international conflict. So mercenary soldiers are traveling much further than they've ever had to travel before. And I think that like opening up of the world, the expanding of the world has emotional consequences. It makes people feel homesick, I suppose, or makes it more likely that people will experience homesickness. And with any great kind of societal or cultural shift, there are reactions against that. There are both in terms of sort of political reactions, but also individual psychic, emotional reactions. And I think nostalgia is partly a response to an increasingly global world.
We have there's this curious phenomenon of people being nostalgic for things they couldn't possibly have experienced. The internet is awash with people talking about, what wasn't life simpler back in the day, back in the 1940s, and well, unless you're 90 um,
Mm.
and on TikTok for some reason, then and then no, I mean, what what's that about? I mean, and why do we encounter this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's, so I would say the majority of nostalgic kind of discourse, for want of a better word, that you see like online and in media and stuff is exactly that kind of historical nostalgia. You see it in all sorts of places like medieval reenactments, any kind of like lots of those sorts of popular history kind of experiences play
Yeah.
off people's nostalgia for what they think was a kind of simpler or more hierarchical or more something time. And I think that's exactly it. I think I mean, nostalgia of all sorts, whether it's nostalgia for your own life or nostalgia for a life you didn't live, is by its sort of nature an inaccurate portrayal of the past, right? And
Yeah.
like it's a rose-tinted view of what's come before, whether that means that you don't remember or don't recall bad experiences you had as a kid, or whether it's because you strip out all of the disease, deprivation. And I think the thing that's appealing to a lot of people about the past is some of it is that more kind of troubling ideas about like, well, I wish we lived in a time which wasn't so progressive or wasn't so ethnically diverse or wasn't so didn't have as much gender equality. You know, there is obviously that element of it,
Mhm.
but I think there's also something that people feel it can be reassuring in some ways, a kind of there's something appealing about a more, even if it's fiction, right? But a more appealing about a more predictable social order, a more kind of stable social hierarchy, less technology. People think that there's something about, yeah, a sort of simpler life or a life lived closer to nature or a
Yeah.
life lived, without at a slower pace. And I think that people find, that idea very appealing. And that for some reason then gets projected onto the past, even if as historians know that the past was, they didn't have iPhones in the 19th centuries, but they had a lot of other stresses.
Well, this is
I,
this is the thing, and I mean, there was a meme where there was, a family in the 1960s all watching, I think, Steptoe and Son or something like that, and it was like, oh, a simpler time. And you think, yeah, but the anxieties around television in the mid 1960s about, what was this awful box in the corner going to do to society? Is it going to destroy the working class culture? And those anxieties are very similar to the anxieties we have around smartphones and, chat GPT, or
absolutely.
the anxieties around railways, that you're imagining times that were in transition themselves.
Yeah, because all times are in transition. I think there's sort of a fiction that there were times when, time stood still, that everyone was happy and content with, the way the world works. And that's just never been the case. And absolutely right. I think like in the 19th century, people were incredibly anxious about the coming of the railways. They thought it was the decline and fall of civilization, that people would, pass out at the very mere sight of a fast moving locomotive. People were very anxious about the coming of telephones, thought there'd be this sort of fundamental intrusion into the sanctity of the home, that people would never be able to like switch off, which obviously we still have those anxieties about mobile phones now, but they had them about, phones attached to a wall with a cable, or phones that you had to like go into the village to like access. And my favorite example for this is I write about it in the book. There's this great bit where Samuel Pepys, the 17th century diarist, is describing how he first gets a pocket watch. And the pocket watch only shows the hours, it doesn't show the minutes. So it's only going to change, once an hour. But he writes about how he's absolutely addicted to taking it out of his pocket every few minutes. He's bringing it out, looking at it. He's like, lamenting. He's like, oh God, my life's never going to be the same again. My attention span is shot. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with this timepiece. It's the end of my productivity. It's the end of everything. And, you see exactly the same conversations happening now about smartphones, about social media that like, is supposed to have destroyed our capacity to, do anything else. We're just addicted to them. But no one would now think that about a wristwatch. They wouldn't be like, oh God, I mustn't have a wristwatch because it's too distracting or too, compelling somehow as to taking away from my real work.
And
So yeah,
that
people
moment
always, every generation have their own edges.
And that moment you describe with Pepys, I mean, it's a really important and interesting historical moment because the thing that we later then call factory time,
Mm.
essentially a recorded, ordered, structured time that isn't natural time, suddenly it's in your pocket, and that must have been a staggeringly important moment for and compelling. Well, I
Yeah.
have one of my kind of pet theories about nostalgia all revolves around the popularity of Lord of the Rings uh, and The Hobbit during during some pretty fraught times in the 20th century. These were sort of when you read them actually these really lovely bucolic kind of stories of that again it captures a fantasy Middle Ages that never was. Um, and there was a very interesting article I read on the this kind of historic moment that you find in things like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, which is it depicts essentially the end of the Middle Ages, just as the kind of an old world is essentially dying out. And I think that that's kind of in terms of nostalgia, I think fantasy actually offers roots into um, into these kind of comforting worlds. But yeah, that was my little.
Definitely. I, I totally agree. I mean, I write a bit about the like how popular Lord of the Rings was, even in the States in the 60s and 70s and Game of Thrones, I think, is another great example. I think it's a really interesting, as you say, it kind of captures this like late medieval moment. But also there are dragons, the sort
Yeah,
of idea that the borderland between the boundary between the Middle Ages and like fantasy world is like very blurry and that you can kind of pick and choose between. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so appealing to people is that, it feels distant enough that you can kind of project whatever you want on it. It doesn't
mm,
have to, we don't know so much about it almost, so that there's more room for
mm,
imaginative like reconstruction, which is basically what nostalgia is. And I
yeah,
think absolutely that thing of like, it feels reassuring to people for some reason. I think it's so interesting that like there's a great organization in America called the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is a large kind of umbrella organization for loads of different reenactors, and they've kind of put together a kind of imagined medieval America, like European medieval America. So it's like they've got history to it where it's like the European Middle Ages and not like the Native American Middle Ages that it really was. Um, but it's very interesting talking to people who participate in this organization and they acquire like whole other identities. They're like squires and knights that they have like names and they live their whole lives or, extended periods of time as those characters. And I think it's an opportunity, when there's all these interviews with people and people will say like, well, why do what's appealing about it? What draws it to you? And someone says, oh, well, no one's going to reenact an IT manager or I'm a like, some sort of quotidian normal job, but I can play at being a knight or a lord or a
yeah,
squire or, something fun. And I also can, you know, play a totally different life. It gives you a kind of, you
yeah.
know, there's something so appealing about that. I completely like empathize, even if I don't personally participate.
But this is my theory about kind of when you get this sort of all this kind of hokum around past life regression, nobody ever gets regressed to something mundane. They were
Yeah.
always kind of a Native American chief or in the Vietnam War. They weren't a kind of a pottery worker in 13th
No,
century,
no.
which
No, and there's all these ideas I think about like so this you get this loads in the 19th century when like people like William Morris, arts and crafts movements are like really nostalgic for a medieval past and they're like, oh, even, the because they're reacting against the factory, the sort of
yeah,
brutalizing regime of the factory and the workhouse of the 19th century. And they're saying, even poor, like all the poor people of the Middle Ages, they loved their work. They got great pleasure and joy and doing whatever there was. And you're like, did they, or were they also just miserable in the same way that, being really poor at any time can be pretty miserable.
Well, there's
Um,
this kind of Marxist idea of alienation, that weavers went into, they had this lovely time in their cottages and then went into dark satanic mills. The mills were certainly dark and satanic, but if you look at the kind of the living conditions of pre-industrial weavers, it's not nice. It's not like a
yeah,
lark.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
exactly, yeah.
and so nostalgia is this kind of, I guess, this sort of socially created thing, which is a very kind of both comforting but fraught and problematic. And there was one thing I just wanted to hit upon that you'd mentioned previously. The kind of the abuse of nostalgia that we see in the present moment. I mean, a lot of these things on the internet, the kind of memes and things like that. There's a kind of a coded racism that runs through them in the what sort of what's different. What's different between now and then. I can't guess what if you catch my drift. And that sort of subtext. It's a way of kind of communicating things that can't be openly said.
Hmm. I think that, I mean, the best example of that obviously is like the Trumpian project, the Make America Great Again. It's like the most quintessentially nostalgic slogan. And it's been used by other politicians and both in the States, Reagan also had it as a slogan. And the British Conservatives in the 50s and 60s also had Make Britain Great Again as a slogan. And the thing that's so great about it, and not really great, but the thing that's so effective about it is that it can kind of mean anything to anyone. And
Yeah.
you don't have to be, and that's one of Trump's real skills, really, is that he kind of says nothing while not saying a lot. He says a lot, but doesn't really say anything. And so, I think that and Make America Great Again is exactly that, that like, well, what do you think has been made worse? He doesn't have to say necessarily, although obviously often he does, but he doesn't necessarily have to say,
Yeah.
the reasons why I think America's got worse. He can just allude to that, and people can
Mm.
fill in their own blanks dependent on what their particular concern and anxiety is. And I think the thing that's so like bad and pernicious about it, especially as a historian, is that the way that people like him who have, as you say, really like co-opted or abused nostalgia, is that he also suggests that there is nothing about the past that would be worth resurrecting, because I think the problem is not so much nostalgia, it's what people are nostalgic for. Like nostalgia, if you're nostalgic for, say, if you go back to the people I was talking about, and this is obviously dependent on your own particular political perspectives, but if you go back to the people who are very nostalgic about the NHS of days gone by,
Mhm.
I'm also nostalgic for a post-war Britain where the welfare state was, you know, at the front and center of the political project, where they had, a really optimistic vision about state investment, about what the state could offer people and what the state could provide for people. Like I am nostalgic for that moment. And if I read about that sort of historical period, then sometimes I get this pang of like, what the world could have been had that project come to fruition, or if, things had gone a slightly different way. And I don't think that the problem there necessarily is nostalgia. The problem is, some people are racist. And and like if they're going to be, if they're going to be nostalgic for a, whiter past, if you took away their ability to be nostalgic, they'd still be racist. They'd just be racist about the present. Yeah, I just think it's like, I think there are politicians who have really done great damage by kind of co-opting these really powerful nostalgic narratives. But I also think that nostalgia is not really the cause of these issues. It's just a
No,
facet of.
no. And it is something I think that probably people do almost instinctively, in response to the kind of the pressures and the complexities of life.
Yeah,
We'll
absolutely.
draw to a close in a moment, but before we do, let's have a quick plug for the book. Available in all good bookshops at the moment, Nostalgia,
It is, yeah, and bad bookshops too.
and bad bookshops. Um, and so, as I always say on this podcast, if do go out, get yourself a copy, but please support your local independent bookshop, the good kind. Um, and Agnes, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today. It really has been a fascinating conversation. And I do hope perhaps we can continue it in the future about a multiplicity of topics. But thank you
Thank you.
so much for coming on, and all the very best with the book. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Take good care.